The Venerable W is a documentary directed by Barbet Schroeder, and it covers the ongoing ethnic tensions between the Muslim minority and the Buddhist majority in Myanmar through the portrait of one of the leaders of the anti-Muslim movement, a Buddhist monk called Wirathu, who is the titular W on the movie poster. Barbet Schroeder has had a very interesting life and career. He was born in Iran from a German and Swiss couple. He is a Swiss citizen. He's lived a large part of his life in France, or at least worked in French cinema. He's moved from collaborations with Pink Floyd, with Moore, to documentary filmmaking, to fiction filmmaking in the United States, with films like Barfly, with Mickey Rourke and Faye Dunaway, or films like Single White Female. I think what he will ultimately be mostly remembered for is his remarkable work in the documentary field. The Venerable W marks his third film in the trilogy of evil that he has directed, which comprise of Idi Amin Dada, A Self-Portrait, and Terror's Advocate. I mention Idi Amin Dada, A Self-Portrait because I think there are very clear parallels between this and this new film that just came out. For those of you who haven't seen it, Idi Amin Dada, Self-Portrait is a documentary that follows Amin Dada, who was the brutal and murderous dictator of Uganda for several years. If you're not aware of who Amin Dada was, you may recall him being portrayed in a film by Forrest Whitaker, for which he won an Oscar, called The Last King of Scotland. Amin Dada, A Self-Portrait, follows him around, just leading the country, and the film, it feels like the film set out with certain goals to expose, a sort of evil character, but as the film progresses, it's almost hijacked by its main character. I mean, you can definitely sense the darkness, the evil within, the underlying fear, but he's such an incredibly charismatic person to watch that it's almost morbidly fascinating, and you can't help but be entranced by this character at an almost fictional level, and you kind of feel disgusted at being so entertained by watching this horrible person that just killed so many people. I mention this because it feels like Barbet Schroeder really did everything he could not to let that happen again. The film does not limit itself to just following Wirathu around. He also uses a lot of news footage. He uses a voiceover very sparsely to distill some information. He uses interviews with other Myanmar monks, other people that are Myanmar citizens, people that work for ONG, so you definitely get a counterpoint. And this film, as a result, certainly feels more balanced and more in line with its original intent. So the film sort of recaps his life, his movement, and the situation that is going on in Myanmar over the past several years. So the first thing that struck me is I can't pretend to know anything about what's going on in that part of the world. But it takes a community, a people, the Buddhists, that we generally associate with being very calm, very peaceful. They really have a very positive image over here in the West, at least. We associate them with the Dalai Lama and meditation and vegetarianism and being peaceful, and generally with being oppressed. In the Tibetan situation, they are certainly the victims of the Chinese government. So just a community with a very, very positive image. And on the other side, you have Muslims who in the West, insert whatever cliche you want about the Muslims, terrorist, violent, whatever you want, who have been very much vilified in popular culture, in films, in television. And this time they are the victims. And what that does is it really sort of highlights this idea that there's no one good community or good people or bad community or bad people. It's all extremely circumstantial and relative, and that one man's oppressor is another man's victim. And it's a really dark thing to think about, and something that's sort of exterior to the film, but that I really couldn't shake out of my head was I was watching this situation and sort of envisioning this sort of dark, dystopic, worst case scenario vision of what could happen in the West. When you look at Viratu's methods of how he's spreading his message, how he is gaining in popularity. It really is a textbook case of how all sort of extreme identitarian movements go about. The way they describe the Muslims as a foreign invasion that are a threat to their race, their religion, their way of life, that are going to marry their women and so convert them to Islam, and that as a result their entire people will disappear, which is a message that is not only extremely relevant to what we're hearing with certain movements over in the West, it's exactly, I mean, almost exactly how the Nazis portrayed the Jews in the 30s. I mean, they even trot out the sort of the Muslims, they have businesses, they have commerces, you know, they have money, so we shouldn't support those businesses, and you should only do business with people that are Buddhist. So the strategies they use are very much in line with sort of every other extreme identitarian movement that we've come to know. And even the way you see them go about diffusing their propaganda is absolutely fascinating. Wiratu never overtly calls to violence in the film, but he's always calling to a sort of defense, a defense of the home state, a defense of the nation. And then they accuse the Muslims of burning down their own houses to get financial aid from the UN or something, which is, you know, just crazy conspiracy theories. And they also diffuse a huge amount of propaganda by making films. Wiratu has a very successful Facebook page. So it's like this old school, very tried and true method of every extreme group you've ever known, plus, you know, social media and use of fake news, diffusing stories of rapes, gang rapes, and riots and violence that are either overblown or outright false. And this leads to a brilliant and very disturbing scene where you see Wiratu showing a propaganda video on his cell phone that his group made to explain the dangers of the Muslims, and they make this fictional recreation of a gang rape and murder of a Buddhist woman. And while he's showing this, he has this like huge smile on his face, as if like he is so happy about what he just did. And in that moment, I mean, up until then, what comes out of his mouth is, you know, extremely upsetting. But he doesn't look like he's insane, but in that moment, you can feel the evil and the insanity that is emanating from his being. Another thing that I want to talk about concerning the film is how it makes this amazing case for documentary filmmaking over televisual news. Obviously, it's not an indictment of journalism and the written press as a whole, but certainly in terms of, 24-hour news networks and televisual news, I mean, all they're concerned about is whatever Trump poop tweeted in the morning or, Justin Trudeau's socks. It really takes documentaries in many cases to shine a light on what's actually going on in the world. It's very hard to review a documentary, especially when you don't know anything about the subject and the film is literally teaching you things. And there are probably things that it left out, maybe things that it didn't get perfectly right that I would have absolutely no idea. So I wouldn't feel confident judging it on those levels. What I can say is that I definitely think people should watch it. I think it's an important film. It has an extremely important message. And this leads us to this final thought that I have for this video, which is, what is the difference between a great film and an important film? Because I wouldn't consider this a great film. I would say it's important. Whereas I would say that Idi Amin Dada, A Self-Portrait, is a great film. That's obviously very subjective, but there is a level of transcendence that takes away from the message of Idi Amin Dada, but makes it a fascinating creation. This falls back on a much more informative and didactic format, which makes it both less grandiose, but also more on message, and ultimately extremely important. A film that I generally use as an example of this distinction is a film called Indigène, which was released in 2006, which was commercialized in the United States, I believe, under the name Days of Glory. Taken solely within the context of being a film, it's fine. I don't really like it all that much. There are better war films. There are films that are a lot more subtle. But in terms of what it talks about, which is about the North African soldiers that fought for the French army in World War II, it was so important for that entire forgotten generation of people to be represented on screen, and it had such an impact even in French politics. What you need to know is that not only were those people not talked about before, is they weren't even given the same pensions as, French-born war veterans. And that changed thanks to that film. So no matter what your thoughts are on the film as an individual work of art, it certainly helped shape the conversation, and from a social standpoint really moved things forward in a positive direction. And this really is where I fall on the Venerable W. It isn't the most visually pleasing or transcendental or mind-blowing film that you'll see this year, but the actual message that transpires through it is of critical importance at this point in time. I would warn you that it's an incredibly depressing film. There are some very upsetting scenes of violence, of dead bodies, of people being burned alive, of people being killed with just planks of wood. It really is an unsettling film to watch, and it ends on one of the most depressing images and thoughts that I think I've ever seen in a documentary, let alone in a film, which I took away as this idea that things are only going to get worse, and not just in Myanmar, but just in terms of ethnic tensions in general. So thank you very much for watching this video. As always, if you liked the video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and until next time, see ya.